Who owns Pokémon is a question with a set of well-established answers. In short, it's Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. While that answer is concise, there is a lot of insight into the world's largest multimedia franchise that is lost without taking a moment to peer backstage. Welcome to Castella Insider, a series focused on learning about the field of business and related subjects through the Pokémon franchise. The question posed by this video will allow us to explore common, distinct business structures found in both Japan and the United States, alongside briefly reviewing the history of several familiar companies involved in the Pokémon franchise, ultimately aiming to decipher at least some of the facets behind who owns Pokémon. First, we need a foundation on business structures in order to explore this video's question fairly. To remain in scope, we will only briefly explore a handful of for-profit structures, as all of them are subject to corporate law, which varies across borders of all kinds. To simplify even further, I'm going to exclusively focus on the versions found in the United States with mention of their Japanese equivalents, and only cover the overall idea. Now, business structures can be swapped out for business types, which leads to an analogy. Think of a business like you would a Pokémon, each being unique and the structure it was formed around being its type that provides inherent strengths and weaknesses appropriately. The most common type of business is a sole proprietorship, and its Japanese equivalent to a certain degree is the Kojin Jigo. In the United States, registration isn't required, resulting in this type of entity being easy to begin and easy to dissolve. However, all profits are considered personal income, and there is zero separation between a business and the owner in this type of structure, resulting in what is called unlimited liability, making the owner responsible for all assets and debts of the business. Moving up in complexity, partnerships involve multiple owners. There are several subtypes like general and limited partnership, among others. The Japanese equivalent for a general partnership is a Gomei Kaisha and Goshi Kaisha for limited. The principal difference between these subtypes involves liability. In a general or unlimited partnership, all partners are considered equally responsible. On the other hand, limited partnerships reduce that burden for all owners, and there is also a subtype referred to as a limited partnership that provides limited liability to all partners except for one. Our next business structure is a hybrid between partnerships and corporations, with the company formally becoming its own tax entity, known as a limited liability company, at least in the United States. The primary draw of an LLC is that the personal investment of the owners and those of the business are formally separated. For example, if an LLC defaults on its debt, it's the company's work vehicles that would be claimed as collateral, not the owner's personal vehicle. Another key feature is that the hybrid nature offers flexibility, as LLCs can opt to be pass-through entities, not subject to the same taxes as corporations, or they may choose to act as corporations subject to those taxes. The Japanese equivalent is the Godo Kaisha, which replaced the Yugen Kaisha in 2006. Functionally speaking, the Godo Kaisha draws inspiration from the American take on an LLC, while the Yugen Kaisha was inspired by the Gesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung. Several jurisdictions require limited liability companies to identify themselves as such in their trade name or company name. So look for an LLC or your country's equivalent in the official name of the businesses around you. The last and arguably most well-known are corporations, or in Japan, a stock company known as a Kabushiki Kaisha, or KK. A corporation is a separate legal entity from its owners, but unlike an LLC, they have the ability to raise capital through selling shares of stock either publicly on a public exchange or privately. Depending on the variant, some common elements include articles of incorporation, corporate governance through a board of directors, and so forth. There is a lot to corporations, but for now, that will suffice as a brief summary. Now, let's shift to the main focus of this video. The most logical starting point in the pursuit of our question is the main developers of Pokémon, Game Freak. We can consider them the first set of owners due to the vital role this company and the people behind it have played in the creation of the Pokémon franchise. In the 1980s, Game Freak found its start as a handwritten fan magazine by Satoshi Tajiri, who was later joined by Ken Sugimori and others. Game Freak at this point wasn't officially incorporated as a company, and because of that, they didn't have any credibility. Despite having worked on their first title known as Mindale Palace, or Quinty in Japan, Game Freak struggled to find a publisher due to this lack of credibility. In order to resolve this issue, Game Freak formally incorporated on April 26, 1989, and later that same year, their first title was published by Namco in Japan. Game Freak's first formal project with Nintendo was Yoshi for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Game Boy in 1991. Later, they would also develop Pulseman for the Sega Mega Drive in 1994, among other titles. It was these pre-Pokémon games that gave Game Freak enough financial return, and importantly time, to build relations and experience. These relations and the experience they brought allowed Game Freak to remain persistent in crafting a concept, one that would ultimately become Pocket Monsters over the course of 6 years. The rest is history. There are some fantastic articles and videos dedicated specifically to the history of Game Freak and the Pokémon franchise. Do consider watching those if you're interested, as this was only a brief paraphrase summary. Now, what type of company is Game Freak? Thankfully, Japanese law helps us in this endeavor, as the Companies Act of 2005 legally requires businesses to include their company type in their trade name. By translating Game Freak's native name, we can reasonably conclude that they are a stock company, or a kabushiki keisha. We can also determine if Game Freak is private or public by looking at the public stock exchanges found in Japan, which we don't find a listing, implying Game Freak is a private stock company. Unfortunately, this is where the information becomes more speculative. What we do know is that Satoshi Tajiri is listed as the representative director for Game Freak on the official website. That role provides the most authority to represent the company legally. Corporate governance is a subject in and of itself, and varies based on companies and countries. In short, at least in the United States, executives like the C-suite, CEO, COO, CFO, for example, and the board of directors serve different functional purposes. The executives or employees can be members of the board of directors, which are known as inside directors, or they can consist of members who don't hold a stake in the company, called outside directors. In some smaller companies, the board and company management can consist of the same people. For Game Freak, I simply can't find enough information to determine anything conclusively. If I had to speculate, it's possible that Game Freak's top management also fill the role of board of directors. With additional members from companies with long-standing relations, Nintendo is the biggest and most prestigious of the owners, and acts as the primary distributors and publishers of the franchise's games. It's practically common knowledge that Nintendo is a public corporation, but we can confirm using the same method as Game Freak by translating Nintendo's Japanese name and checking the public Japanese stock exchanges. Doing so confirms that Nintendo is indeed a public stock company. Nintendo has a long history, being founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi, manufacturing Hanafuda playing cards. In 1962, Nintendo went public, listing itself on both the Kyoto Stock Exchange and the Osaka Security Exchange. A year later, Nintendo officially adopted its current name, Nintendo Co. Limited. The company's first console wasn't the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1983, but instead, it was the Color TV series starting in 1977. Nintendo would enter the arcade industry in 1978, and Nintendo of America would open in New York in 1980 before moving to Seattle, Washington in 1982. Just 1 year later, in 1983, the classic Famicom would be released in Japan, and the system would release in North America in 1985 as the NES. There is more to the history, but for the purposes of this video, that'll suffice. Since Nintendo is public, there is a plethora of financial information made available to provide investors information about the company. So let's take the opportunity to highlight some numbers on the owners of Nintendo, its shareholders. The largest notable shareholder is the Master Trust Bank of Japan, which has about 16.61% of Nintendo's outstanding shares. The rest of the major shareholders listed by Nintendo are mostly financial institutions. But one that might come as a surprise is the Government of Norway, which has 1.64% of the outstanding stocks. Nintendo also provides a pie chart of the distribution of shares, which provides us with more insight. Like that 48.97% of shares issued by Nintendo are owned by entities outside of Japan, while another 28.44% are owned by the aforementioned Japanese financial institutions. Only 5.61% of the shares are owned by individual investors, and another 2.53% owned by fellow Japanese corporations. While these numbers are informative for our prospective investors, it also highlights just how divided up ownership can be for public companies, especially large ones. Now, you may be wondering, what about Nintendo of America or Europe, given that we just looked at Nintendo of Japan? Both of these companies are considered subsidiaries or daughters of Nintendo of Japan, which is referred to as the parent company. As a subsidiary, Nintendo of Japan owns at least 51% of the voting stock, but it's possible that they own all the shares, which is referred to as wholly owned. You may be familiar with several other subsidiaries like Retro Games, Monolith Software, and 1UP Studio. We will be looking at other subsidiary companies later on as well. The last of the trifecta of owners, Creatures Inc., is lesser known than Game Freak or Nintendo, at least on the surface. They have played an important role in the development of the Pokémon trading card game, among many other contributions, including co-creating well-loved spin-off entries. In addition, Creatures has assisted in 3D modeling Pokémon across multiple titles. As a company, Creatures Inc. was founded in 1995, and the following year would craft the Pokémon trading card game. Over the next several decades, Creatures Inc. would assist in developing several known titles, such as Pokémon Snap and Pokémon Ranger with HAL Labs, Pokémon Colosseum, XD Gale of Darkness, and Battle Revolution with Genis Sonority, and would be the primary developers of Shadows of Alma, Guardian Signs, and the Poképark series. When the franchise's core titles transitioned into 3D with X and Y, they would assist with modeling the beloved Pokémon monsters into these games. As with Game Freak, we can translate the Japanese company name for Creatures Inc. and check public Japanese stock exchanges to determine that Creatures is a Kabushiki Keisha and private. While this limits the information available to us, the company website lists Yuji Kitano as president and CEO, having succeeded Harukazu Tanaka and Shunsoftco Ishihara, who is occasionally mixed up with Satoshi Tajiri, due to the former often presenting in Pokémon Directs. You may be wondering, if Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. all own Pokémon, then what about the elephant in the room, the Pokémon Company? It's time to introduce the other players. We know that Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. all formally own Pokémon, and by extension the shareholders of these companies. So where does that leave us with the Pokémon Company itself? Well, the Pokémon Company took on the role of brand management, handling license agreements, marketing, and more. The Pokémon Company itself is what is known as a joint venture, established in 1998 as the Pokémon Center, and is owned by Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. as a Kabushiki Keisha. In order to qualify as a joint venture, separate companies must agree to collaborate for a specific purpose, which in this instance was to handle the ever-increasing opportunities the Pokémon franchise was bringing in, leading to Mr. Ishihara to propose the creation of the Pokémon Company to specifically manage it all. Now, that doesn't mean that the Pokémon Company itself doesn't have its fair share of subsidiaries to help maintain the franchise. Some recognizable names are the Pokémon Company International, Millennium Print Group, and the retail Pokémon Centers are all owned by the Pokémon Company, who in turn is owned by Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc. Another name you might be familiar with, especially if you've played the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon titles, is Spike Chunsoft. When it comes to our question, it's unlikely that we can reasonably consider them an owner of Pokemon. Unlike the Pokémon Company, Spike Chunsoft is an independent subsidiary whose primary shareholder is Dwango Corporation, formed in 1997, which itself is currently a subsidiary of the Kadokawa Group, formed in 1945 as a publishing company and a now well-established entity in the media industry. Let's back up a bit, as Dwango and Kadokawa are outside of this video's scope. Shifting focus back to Spike Chunsoft, we can learn that the company is a result of a merger between Chunsoft and Spike in 2012. Using the same methods mentioned earlier, we can confirm that Spike Chunsoft is a Kabushiki Keisha and is private. Their main business is in the development of video games, being known primarily for the Mystery Dungeon franchise, Danganronpa, and for publishing the visual novel of Steins Gate overseas. While we can reasonably conclude that Spike Chunsoft isn't an owner of Pokemon formally speaking, the Mystery Dungeon franchise, when it collaborated with Pokemon, could be an example of a widely seen and interesting marketing strategy known as co-branding. The short definition is that co-branding is when two or more brands work together to produce a new product or service, in this case a game combining Pokemon characters and Mystery Dungeon gameplay. There are enough examples of co-branding with Pokemon that there could be an independent video focused on highlighting them, or focusing exclusively on a more recent example to explore co-branding and the related strategy co-marketing in depth. The last company that'll be covered with this video plays a notable role in the distribution of the long-running animated series. ShoPro is the shortened form of Shogakukan-Shueisha Productions, which refers to the parent companies Shogakukan and Shueisha, both of which are notable publishing houses in Japan. The subsidiary of ShoPro was established in 1967, and its parent companies, Shogakukan in 1922, and Shueisha, which itself is a subsidiary of the former, was established in 1926, respectively. Like Spike Chunsoft, we will not focus on the parent companies, as their business activities extend well beyond the Pokemon franchise. As a business entity, ShoPro is, as would be expected, a Kabushiki Keisha, and likely an example of a license agreement. Under an agreement, the rights holder of a brand grants another company the rights to use that brand, often in a manner that generates revenue. In the case of Pokemon, this subject is both complicated and lengthy, spanning over 20 plus years, involving multiple companies with their own histories responsible for distribution, broadcasting, and more, from the defunct 4Kids Entertainment, Netflix, and another subsidiary owned by ShoPro, Viz Media, known for Shonen Jump. This concludes our quest, at least on a cursory level, as this topic proved more complex than anticipated. The original intention of this video was to dive into Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. in a more in-depth fashion, explaining how these companies functioned internally, but the general lack of accessible information, combined with being nearly 4 years out of practice, toned down that plan. Regardless, if you found this video worth your time, a like, a comment, and a share would be appreciated, but it is not required. As always, I'll catch you in the next one.